we've hit the limit, and the ocean has been exhibiting the symptoms of global warming and climate change.
Our topic today is climate, oceans, and international law, and you're listening to The Next Page, the podcast of the Library and Archives at UN Geneva, dedicated to advancing the conversation on multilateralism. I'm Amy Smith, and online with me today, we have a distinguished guest, Nilufer Oral. Nilufer Oral is the director of the Centre of International Law at the National University of Singapore. She's a member of the UN International Law Commission. Nilufer is also a member of the Curatorium at the Hague Academy of International Law and an associate member of the Institut du Droit International. She served as legal advisor in climate change negotiations for the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. She is currently a member of the Committee of Legal Experts on the Commission of Small Island States on Climate Change and International Law. She has been a member of the Council of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, and was co-chair of the Ocean Specialist Group of the World Commission of Environmental Law. Needless to say, she has published extensively and is a leading expert in international law with over 2 decades of expertise in ocean governance and climate law, and is currently a co-chair of the ILC study group on sea level rise. So Nilufer, welcome to The Next Page.
Well, dear Amy, thank you so much for that extremely generous introduction. And may I say how thrilled I am to be part of your podcast. And I'm looking forward to talking about a topic that is really very close to my heart and one I have been working on for many years. So I'm very happy to be part of your session today.
That's wonderful. And you were just telling me how this is your favorite topic. So I was interested to know how you first became interested in oceans and climate in relation to international law.
Well, it's interesting because I started off really in law of the sea, more from navigational perspectives and protection of the marine environment. And then I became involved with the IUCN. As you mentioned, I was co-chair of the Ocean Specialist Group. But the real turning point for me in merging or marrying the two issues of climate and ocean really came about when I had this great opportunity to work with and be a legal advisor and negotiator with the Turkish Foreign Ministry for climate change. And that started in 2009. And it was really the negotiations for the Paris Agreement where there was a great opportunity, because I've been working on oceans for so long, to actually bring in ocean to the Paris Agreement. So just a little aside, most people will not know this, but there is one reference in the preamble to ocean in the Paris Agreement. And I was the one who initiated that. So I think for me, it was just, the two issues are so critical and important. And our knowledge at that time, it's changed a lot now, but at that time, they were really seen quite separately. The climate regime was not really paying that much attention to ocean matters. And likewise, the law of the sea was a pre-climate change instrument. So anyway, that's how it all kind of started, I would say.
Well, we'll be delving a bit more into that shortly. But, the ILC has just ended its summer session, and we at the library have a close relationship with the ILC. We love hosting you here during your sessions. The session was a bit compressed due to budget constraints, and it must have been quite difficult to fit everything in. But would you tell us what the study group on sea level rise has been working on in this session?
Thank you. Well, can I say also that the library is such an important part of the commission as well. And so many of us really, part of coming to Geneva is also spending time at the library and its wonderful staff. So I have to express my appreciation. I know it's shared by many of my colleagues at the commission. Now, having said that, back to the question. So yes, there is a liquidity crisis in the UN, and the commission was not spared. We lost 7 weeks out of what should have been a 12-week session. But the only positive, I would say, the only ray of sunlight that came out of this session was we finalized our work on sea level rise in relation to international law. We started in 2019 when the sea level rise in relation to international law topic was placed on our current work program. And then 2020, we did our first issues paper. So in ILC time, in a relatively short period of time, we have completed that work. And this year, the Commission adopted the final report of the study group, which includes a set of conclusions that are quite important, reflecting what we call the convergence of state views on the international legal issues that we addressed, which range from law of the sea. This is the area that I was covering with my dear colleague, Bogdan Orescu, who is now a member of the ICJ. And Patricia Gavo-Ateles, she was doing protection of persons. And Juan Jose Ruda Santolaria was looking at the topic of statehood in relation to sea level rise. So this was a success for us. And that was, I think, one thing that all members of the Commission felt good about in an otherwise rather bleak session.
Well, congratulations on that. It's really very, very important work because the scientific reports on the adverse effects of climate change are just so clear and alarming. And, even very recently in the press, we've seen news articles warning that the planet's remaining carbon budget to meet the international target of 1.5 degrees Celsius has just about 2 years barely left at the current rate of emissions. And just to give an idea of that, Suan Ramanathan in 2017 wrote about the current risk of category of dangerous warming and defined it as greater than 1.5 degrees as dangerous, greater than 3 degrees as catastrophic, and greater than 5 degrees as just unknown, implying beyond catastrophic, including existential threats. And the UNFCCC introduced the term dangerous anthropogenic interference, DAI, with the climate system. Now, as you've already mentioned, we often think more about the Earth in terms when we think about climate, but there's also such a vast effect on the oceans. Would you just give us a bit of an idea of the consequences of a warming climate on the ocean?
Well, the ocean has been kind of, until recently perhaps, the hidden hero that has really been protecting the planet and humans from the dire effects of global warming. And that is because the ocean has absorbed some 90% of the heat, atmospheric heat. So without the ocean, we would have been long gone, I think. And also carbon dioxide. So this is, I don't want to get too technical, but the climate change regime is very focused on forests, land use, the earth. Yet, when we're talking about mitigation and absorption, the ocean has absorbed a quarter, perhaps more, of carbon dioxide. So without the ocean, we really would be in a much more serious situation than we are, and it's already quite serious. But we've hit the limit. And the ocean has been exhibiting the symptoms of global warming and climate change. And this includes the increased temperature of the ocean. Now, we talk about 1.5 degrees, but when we look at the ocean, not every part of the ocean is warming at the same level. Some parts will warm less than others. For example, the Pacific will warm more, and you'll have higher levels of sea level rise. And it's not just sea level rise, it's the impact on marine biodiversity. The corals are, I remember one scientist saying the corals aren't dying, they're burning up basically because of global warming. Coral reefs are essential for life. For example, because of ocean warming, it's not just humans that will be migrating. The fish are already migrating. And this has enormous economic consequences for people. And I think, sometimes people don't relate to them, maybe the abstract notion of nature and the environment, biodiversity, but they should understand that it will impact people, their livelihoods and all that. So the ocean has been absolutely critical. And if we don't protect it, if we don't take the necessary measures, the impacts of climate change will be accelerated and far worse than they are currently. So I'm happy to say that finally, after the Paris Agreement, there is a strong movement by states, and finally, the ocean is getting much more attention than it should be. But is it enough? That's another question.
So I know that you have spoken a lot about what you call a tale of two regimes in terms of international regimes for the climate and ocean. There's a sort of constitution for the oceans, the UN Convention for the Law of the Sea. But that was adopted in 1982 and doesn't reference climate change very much. Then there's the UN Framework for Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, and that mostly concerns atmospheric climate change and makes lesser mention of the ocean. You've mentioned the preamble. But there is also the Paris Agreement and there's the Kyoto Protocol. But since we're dealing with such interrelated issues, such as climate and oceans, what are the limitations of these separate regimes? Why have you talked about this being a tale of two regimes?
Yeah, thank you. That was a presentation I did at the UN actually a few years ago. And I also had the pleasure of doing a UN digital library they do and talking about that. So I think it's from there. And of course, other scholars have looked at this issue as well, that until recently, and I'll explain why recently, of course, as you very clearly pointed out, these two regimes, because it's not just one instrument, they each have, additional instruments and practice, they really seem separate from each other. The Law of the Sea Convention missed out climate change just a few years because in 1988, it was Malta that brought to attention climate change to the General Assembly. So just by a few years, but interestingly enough, between 1973 and 1982, it just was not, just wasn't an issue. So you see nothing in the convention for the records of that. Interestingly, for the climate change, was so focused on land and, for example, forests. And of course, it's important. But the ocean was really seen under the UNFCCC as what I call functional. It's, you need it as a sinker reservoir, to absorb and store carbon dioxide. And that was there was no special program. Even the Convention on Biological Diversity was missing the marine environment until came much later on. Yeah, I know. They had to later on, oh, yes, we have to think about marine protected areas and that. Now, what has happened, and I think this is where I, along with some other scholars, really wanted to bring that attention to that. But as you know, recently, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea issued a very significant and historic advisory opinion, which precisely addressed this issue. It was, the relationship between the climate regime, particularly Paris, the Paris Agreement, and the Law of the Sea Convention. I'm a member of the Commission on the Small Island States that brought the request for the advisory opinion, asking questions, it was greenhouse gas pollution. And that was inherent to one of the questions is, what are the responsibility of states to protect and preserve the marine environment from pollution under Part 12 and all that. And so one of the key questions was, what is the relationship, of course, between the Law of the Sea Convention and the Paris Agreement and the 1.5? And you had certain states who wanted to have the Paris Agreement override the obligations under UNCLOS. Why? Because UNCLOS has very clear obligations. I think it's one of the best environmental, Part 12, hard instruments we have. There are very clear obligations. Paris Agreement was negotiated very differently. And so you had states who would say, well, listen, we have these nationally determined contributions, those should be, that's how we're meeting our obligations. And that's really what should count because Paris is lex specialis. But as you can imagine, of course, the tribunal took a position that basically said, no, Paris is not lex specialis. Of course, it's important. It informs how we interpret the obligations under the Law of the Sea Convention, but the Law of the Sea Convention stands on its own feet. And there are very clear obligations. And so, one, greenhouse gas emissions do constitute pollution under the convention. And right there, once you say that, all those other obligations kick in. The tribunal established a very high threshold, a due diligence threshold. So now we no longer have a tale of two regimes. We now understand from this advisory opinion that the Law of the Sea Convention applies to climate change, and that there's a very clear obligation for states to protect and preserve the marine environment. So I would say that in the sense that mission accomplished is very good to finally see the ocean getting the deserved and needed attention from international law.
Wonderful. So it really has integrated. Is it sufficient?
Well, it's a very important start. Now the ball is in the states' hands. And I think here people say, well, it's an advisory opinion, Well, as we know, advisory opinions are important, and it's become very evident. They're authoritative statements. And I mean, even though it's technically not binding, who's going to ignore something that, a tribunal has said? We're waiting now, of course, for the ICJ. And I think that will be critical for that. So the next step, of course, is for states and how this will be implemented. And that's where everyone has responsibilities. And I think there's a very important responsibility also for civil society to make sure states are reminded of these obligations and how they will be implemented. So we'll see. ICJ probably coming up quite soon, and that will certainly clarify even more the integration of these two regimes.
That's great. We'll look forward to that. And, you've mentioned how people really need to understand how it affects them and their livelihoods. So let's talk a little bit about sea level rise and statehood. According to the NASA Earth Observatory and satellite data on sea level observations, the mean sea level has risen about 101 millimeters since 1992. Millimeters may not sound a lot, but it is an awful amount, and it continues to rise at a rate of 3.9 millimeters per year. So one of the risks of sea level rise is this potentially huge numbers of people who could be displaced. And so here we are with the question of statehood. Tell us a bit more about the issues that sea level rise brings and what the Commission observes and proposes to deal with such issues.
Yes, thank you. So this, the issue of statehood is one of the issues that has really captivated the interests of many. The notion that a state could physically, disappear from sea level rise. Now, I have to say that what's a lot, there have been many changes and evolutions since the Commission took up this topic. And of course, it's my dear colleague, Professor Ruta Santalario, Juan Jose, who has been really focusing on the statehood issue. So there's never been a case where the state has politically, yes, physically disappeared. But instead, what we're saying, no, it's really the question not of disappearing. We're talking about the submergence of territory. So the question is, yes, so we're changing the narrative. There's no sinking states, no disappearance. It's a question of you have now land territory that is either partially or entirely maybe submerged. And of course, the question is, well, what does this mean for statehood? And of course, what do we mean by statehood? Of course, it's the rights that go along with it, the obligations. And the ones who are at risk are the small island states, particularly in the Pacific. And these are also known as large ocean states. So the question, this is what we really wanted to do, is integrate these questions as well with the law of the sea. Because land territory, even if small, can actually generate enormous areas of ocean space, exclusive economic zones. And this ocean space is absolutely critical for the livelihoods for the islanders. Fishing, well, maybe even tourism, but really does come down to, the marine living resources. So the statehood is, what's the relationship then between, the territory, the statehood, what happens to rights? Of course, displacement of persons is another issue as well. So these are the issues we looked at. And particularly, as I said, the study group under the guidance of our dear colleague Juan Jose. And I have to say the evolution was one, well, how do you address this? Then the question, we had a declaration by the Pacific Islands Forum in 2023. And here the issue was put in the context as a presumption of the continuity of statehood. So the statehood continues, there's a presumption. However, that has also evolved, where now the question is, well, presumption, or are we talking about a principle, or simply just accepting the continuity of statehood? And there's very practical reasons for this. Hopefully this will never happen, actually, but if it does, it's still sometime in the future. But during this time period, people on these islands still live there. And there's still activity. So the notion that that island may no longer exist brings other detrimental consequences. So we have to start operating from the notion now. And I think that is really the next step. And that's kind of where the Commission's conclusions have left us at. We're now talking about continuity of statehood. And so how do we implement that continuity of statehood? But there's also the issue of those territories that we partially submerged. And that is perhaps even more, not more critical, but the consequences may be felt even in a greater dimension, because this is where displacement of persons comes in. If people in low-lying coastal areas and islands, but also we're talking low-lying, there are many states that are already experiencing this. Millions of people live near the coast. That's the livelihoods. They fish. This is where their livelihoods are. They can't live there anymore. Internal displacement is a big issue. We already have this problem right now, and now it will be enhanced with sea level rise. So these are the real consequences that we are facing. Unfortunately, the level of greenhouse gas emissions is not being mitigated adequately to say, okay, but we are under control. Our trajectory is showing 2.7 degrees centigrade increase, not 1.5. And even 1.5 is hot. Right now we're at 1.1. Some places 1.5. And that's the thing. These are the global averages. So I think this is why everyone will feel the impacts of sea level rise, either directly or indirectly because of displacement of persons, the economic consequences. So luckily, the UN has really taken this issue up. And if you want, we can talk about that next, but I'll just stop here.
I'm tempted to know more. It's really fascinating hearing about the evolution of the thinking and understanding behind this. So please, go on. Continue.
I will. Yes. So we have this. So now that we have completed our work in the Commission and the report is out and it was adopted by the entire Commission, which is very important. And the next step really will be in the hands of states. And they already have taken these steps. And we know the Secretary General for some years now has made sea level rise a priority. We have the photos of him, with, I think was it in Micronesia or Fiji, where he's rolled up his pants in the water showing the sea level rise. So the Security Council actually had a debate on sea level rise, only on sea level rise. And it was the first time ever that we know of, at least, that the Commission actually was at the table and spoke and was represented. And that was a very important, because that's where we had many states, one, expressing the importance of sea level rise, the implications, of course, for security, And also the solutions being that one of the issues, and we haven't gotten into the technical details, but for example, for the law of the sea is the idea that, okay, do we have to change baselines and outer limits of maritime boundaries, which means the entitlements that go along with them because of sea level rise? Or can states preserve existing baselines? Sometimes they talk about fixing. And what we've seen is a very strong emergence of views of states in favor of preserving those baselines, preserving those entitlements. And this was expressed at the Security Council. Of course, I mean, at the meeting of the Security Council, it was not for adopting a resolution or anything, but that was very important. The United States, Japan, many countries expressed that. Then the General Assembly held its first ever high-level summit just on sea level rise last year. And they will have a follow-up next, and partly because waiting for the report of the commission. So we see that in this sense, it's a positive story in a very negative time period where under the UN, the multilateralist system is working to find solutions under international law to address the consequences of sea level rise, such as preserving existing lawfully established and duly notified maritime boundaries, such as looking to the continuity of statehood, and also examining the very important question of human rights, displacement, and what can be done about that. So this is now moving from the Commission into the broader UN bodies, and this is very important. So we're very hopeful, of course, that the UN will take the necessary steps, and we hope that the Commission has provided them with the tools, the legal tools, as to what would those next steps be: adopting a resolution, interpretive statements, maybe additional instruments in areas where they need to have those instruments. But the good news is that there is great attention, serious attention on this issue. And it is no longer just an issue that concerns the Pacific Islands or AOSIS, but is really cross-regional. And this is something that is reflected in our final consolidated report.
There's a big step forwards. You've talked earlier about the economy too, and the way that climate affecting the oceans affects people's livelihoods as well. Talking about acidification of the ocean, it's increased by 30% since pre-industrial times. And it strikes me that there's so little recognition of the importance of the ocean for human well-being and of the very unsustainable human activities that impact the marine environment. Would you just give us a very quick overview of the process of acidification and the implications for nature and people's livelihoods?
Yes, it is true. Ocean acidification is less known, partly because it really wasn't until, I think, 2007 where the IPCC for the first time included in its report phenomenon of ocean acidification. And as I mentioned earlier, the ocean has absorbed some 25% of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what happens, I'm really a layperson on this, but basically there's this whole chemical process that happens when it absorbs this excess carbon dioxide, which in the simplest terms means that shellfish can no longer produce their shells. It impacts skeletal formation. When I used to do presentations, I would have like a photo of a menu of all the different shellfish and lobsters and crabs, and I think people can relate to that. Like, guess what? If we continue this way, you'll probably not have, those oysters you love and lobsters. And this is already recognized in oyster producing countries like the United States. They have massive oyster farms. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. So economically, it has huge impact. So those who are dealing with the shellfish industry are quite aware. The question is, how do you address this? And I mean, it's just shocking when you see that. So what it does, it impacts the pH balance. And the ocean pH balance has been stable for millions of years. But because of our human activities, that's why they call it the Anthropocene era. We humans have altered the pH balance of the ocean. What that means, so of course, for the biodiversity. I mean, we know this the whole food chain, and so it creates a tremendous imbalance in the system. So we will be depleted of marine living organisms, and humans rely on that. Not, oh, what a pity. We won't have this biodiversity. Maybe people don't relate to that, but they should relate to the fact that you'll be hungry. You won't have a job, things like that.
Exactly. Just as a side mention, this year is the 30th anniversary of the UN Fish Stocks Agreement. And this year, too, the UN Office of Legal Affairs Division for Ocean Affairs and Law of the Sea will be issuing the Third World Ocean Assessment. Would you tell us a bit more about the link between, or is there a link between this assessment process and UNCLOS, and what we can hope for following this assessment cycle?
Well, I have to say that, of course, the fish stocks agreement is under UNCLOS, so it is part of the UNCLOS process. It is important. I have to say that also, the fish stocks agreement is also more under the radar. It doesn't attract quite the same attention, yet it's so important as well. And considering that it was adopted, it was at 1995. I have to remember now when it went into effect, but this is only the third, so that's very significant. And unfortunately, too, we know that the fish stocks are not doing that well. Despite the years of the alarm bells sounding on fish stocks. Of course, the fish stock agreement specifically on highly migratory and straddly fish stocks. So it will be an important assessment. But again, the question is, what do we do afterwards? And the state of fish stocks in the world, this is not my area of expertise in terms of, fisheries. But I do know I've been looking at the FAO reports, the Kofi reports as well. And there's still many fish stocks that are not at sustainable limits. I have to say, too, that, when we talk about the convention, one of the issues that have come up about that is that, of course, it was adopted before we had notions of sustainability, actually. And so the whole structure of it is a maximum sustainable yield. It's really based on a consumption. And now, that they've been trying to change that to conservation. So that's one of the challenges, I think, that there is with the convention. But we also learn that the convention is extremely adaptable. And we know that and we won't get into that, but the 2015 advisory opinion from UNCLOS on illegal, unregulated, unreported fisheries, where it did a very good job of adapting that notion into a convention that didn't have it, to be honest. So
it really is fascinating to see all these changes and evolution in international law. How would you, as we close, how would you encourage young lawyers who are attracted to this field about entering the field and working on these issues?
Well, I would definitely encourage them. I remember many, maybe some 20 years ago when I was just kind of myself, kind of getting more into this area and talking with some of the founders of the Law of the Sea Convention. And, it had been adopted. The tribunal had been set up. And there was this, I remember they were saying, well, we wonder if, whether that's it. There will no longer be any issues. Turned out not to be the case at all. It is one of the most dynamic areas. There's so much happening just in the span of 20 years. Now we have the BBNJ agreement. For those who don't know what that means, that's basically, some call it the High Seas Agreement, but it is an entirely new agreement under the Law of the Sea Convention for the protection of marine biological diversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction. This vast area. And no one would have believed that to have been possible just some years ago. And yet it's been successfully adopted, close to ratification, apparently, not too far away. That's hopeful signs, though. There was the Nice conference, and President Macron made this representation that by the new year expected to have the 60 ratifications. Other areas as well. There's just seabed mining, the whole issue of, environment. There's a navigational issue. So I would say that the law of the sea is one of the most dynamic areas. Ocean law, you can say, for international law. Great people as well, I have to say. That's important who you work with. So I would strongly encourage and recommend young people, like everything, finding work and jobs. But I'm someone who really believes if you really, really want to do something, have that passion for it, be patient. It will happen, because that's what happened to me. I really would never have thought that I would have had this great career that I've had if you'd asked me as a young person. But it happens. So that's always I want to give an encouragement to young people.
That is very encouraging, and it really does sound like you're pushing the frontiers. So, Nilufer Oral, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Amy. It's been wonderful, and I really enjoyed it, and thank you for inviting me.